Here we go.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, my name is Robert. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is July 22nd, 2014. Um, that's not my original sobriety date. I had to go out and do some more experimenting, and I can honestly say that it hasn't gotten any better out there. Yeah, so my home base is Bristol, Tennessee. Right now, I'm in Indiana. I travel a lot for work, which actually is advantageous. I get to go to a lot of different meetings, a lot of different places. Um, and I get to see how AA is done in other areas. I thought I'd start off with one of my favorite passages in the big book. It's on page 47, and we agnostics at the top of the page when it says, "When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you." And that was an important passage for me. Um, I grew up, I didn't have any, but like people say, religion of their parents. We had a Bible, it sat on the shelf, and we were invited if we ever wanted to pick it up and read it, that was okay. you know, um, but we were told go find your own way. And that kind of set me on a path. Um, I was always seeking, right? I think I started out in Methodist church, went to Episcopalian church, went to uh, a bunch of different denominations, sometimes drugged by girlfriends who wanted to save me. Um, Not that it worked. Uh, I studied with shaman. I studied with a druid. I am an ordained minister through the spiritualist church. That one was an interesting story. I went to get married to my present wife. We've been married, well, I guess it's coming up on 28 years. I might have got that wrong. But um, I'll hear about it later if I did. She's on right now. But the condition was that if the church that we got married in, that the minister said, "Well, yeah, I'll marry you, but you need you to become a minister." And so I studied and got ordained. Um, if you're not familiar with the spiritualist church, they were the church that got started somewhere around the 1800s. They believe talking with spirits is part of the norm, that people don't necessarily that you can communicate with people that passed on, which actually kind of agrees a lot with some of the native traditions about our ancestors. Um, I spent a lot of time looking for that conception of God. And what I learned in Alcoholics Anonymous is that's going to constantly evolve, right? Um, I definitely have some basis in the Native American traditions. Um, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Road to Wellbriety by White Bison Press. It's kind of like a adjunct to the Alcoholics Anonymous. Um, and if you're Native American or if you have those leanings, that I think that there's a lot of value in the way they teach, walk through the steps. Um, and I've been to a couple of those meetings. I'd like to find them everywhere I go, but they're just not everywhere. They're great meetings. So you start off by smudging and you walk the circle, and then you sit down and they kind of employ the talking stick. It's quite an experience. I would encourage anybody, if you can find the Red Road to Recovery meetings, to check them out. I guess I could say I never did quite fit in, and then go surprised, maybe the other alcoholics have felt that way. I was a kid that, for my history projects, I wrote about the Salem witchcraft trials or, some other odd thing that most kids didn't pick. I was always interested in, I guess, what you would call the supernatural, things. Um, Later in my drinking, I used that kind of an excuse because I said, well, now I'm an adult. My conscious mind gets in the way. I gotta knock it out. So let me knock it out. Um, and I was a barroom psychic. I actually did some work as a psychic before. And um, what I can tell you is that those are ego feeding propositions, no matter how spiritual you think you want to be. Um, and that lends to a whole lot of, oh, I know what you're thinking. And instead of just being, I've since then discovered through the program and things like that, it's much better to ask somebody what they're thinking or what they're feeling than to, think I'm reading them. um, it's one of those things that um, I was pretty good at, but it I guess is one of those distractions that the spirit likes to throw at us. Let's see if we can lead you. See how strong you are in the path. If we can lead you away. And it still happens from time to time. I get the feeling that I know what other people think of me, and then I have to remind myself it's really none of my business. Because I spent my whole life wanting to be the good guy, right? Wanting to be the guy that everybody turned to, wanted to be, you know. Uh, well, like the good guy, whatever that means, and when you think about it, I couldn't even define that. Um, but needless to say, alcohol got the best of me. Um, the first time I came into the program was back in '94. At that point, I lived underneath a bridge, only because my parents wouldn't let me drink at home, you know. So whenever I got drunk, which was most nights, I would either stay with friends or I'd go sleep underneath this bridge. Um, anyway, things got obviously out of control, and I went into the program. I was going to go into treatment. We called around and nobody had any information, so we wound up going to this AA hall. Um, and I said, well, yeah, I need to get hooked up with treatment. And they're all like, well, that's not what we do here. But if you sit down, you know, we might be able to teach you, something about how we stayed away from drinking. And, I got about double digits, and then I got in this job, and uh, a lot of traveling, a lot of staring at four walls and in a hotel room, not you know just kind of going nutso and wound up drinking. Um, Came back into the rooms. I sobered up in Buffalo, New York. And the first meeting I went to was in downtown Buffalo, New York, at this place. They still allowed smoking in the room. The guy who was chairing the meeting had exactly 2 weeks sober. People slept there at the hall. But I've discovered I really wasn't into sitting in a smoke-filled room anymore, right? So I got a meeting schedule, and then I found a couple other meetings outside of that one downtown. But I mean, that was frontline stuff. I never went back to that one, but I did go to several of the treatment centers in the area while I was there, doing service work in the treatment centers. So the first thing, admitting I had a problem that my life was unmanageable, that was pretty easy, you know. And I've always had a belief in a higher power and a faith, that things were going to work out because things always had worked out. Not to say I didn't have a bunch of consequences, but by and by things worked out exactly the way they were supposed to. Um, Third step is a little tough, right? Because that means I got to give up, any illusion that I had of power. that and some of the illusions I had to power was, oh, I got this person is counting on me. I can't, you know, can't screw up. It'll just destroy them. You know, that's the ego, right? You know, that I'm so important that if so I do something, it's going to just destroy somebody else. You know, it takes a lot to bring, I guess the saying is bring me down to my right size. And so then some of the ways I got to stop playing God. Kind of on that vein, I was joking around that this is a suit I usually wear to conferences for work, and somebody said, "Oh, or a funeral." Um, Earlier this week, one of the guys I work with, he's in the same, we share the same office, got in a motorcycle accident, and he's not going to make it. Um, so yeah, it might be for a funeral later on next week. His family has decided to keep him alive until they can, all the organ donor stuff is uh, arranged. Um, yeah, I'm more concerned because he's got, three daughters, the youngest of which is 13, and the losing a dad at that age, or any age really, but that young is pretty tough. Um, Things happen. That wouldn't have been the first person that I've lost around me. Um, I do know that the saying in the program that you can wind up going more funerals in the program than you do outside the program is a fact. Sometimes people can't, you know, live in this way of life. And, there's been more than one case where a person's gone out and not come back, that they wound up passing away. So after I kind of got the third step, I internalized, I guess is the best word for it. Um, it's a little bit easier for me to take that pause, that spirit pause, take a minute, and because one of the most useful things I heard in the meeting was, God's in the pause, right? Rather than that knee-jerk reaction or that going back to that old way of dealing with things, take that pause and the God's in that pause. Um, the fourth and fifth steps, those were a little bit tough. My first fourth step coming back into sobriety, I wrote it all out, and then the gentleman that I was working with was not available for 3 weeks. So I sat on that for 3 weeks. That was mighty uncomfortable. It was like looking at those papers and going, "Oh yeah, you're just a petty lowlife," But after going through the fifth step and understanding some of the stuff behind it, you know, um, I'd wanted to be a social worker at one point. I went to college for it. Yet another one of those great beginners because I was a good starter, terrible finisher. Um, and I had a professor. He's always telling me. He says, "You really got to come to terms with why you want to do this." He says, and I said, "Well, because I want to help people." He says, "No, that's not the right answer." He says, "There's always something in it for you. You know, even when you're just, when you think your motivation is just to help somebody, there's always something in it for you. So you gotta come to terms with why you want to do this." Which I thought I did. Turns out not so much. Um, Still wanted to control everything everybody did. If they just listened to me, they wouldn't get hurt or they wouldn't go and do those crazy things and wind up in those crazy situations. Why won't they listen to me? You know, I learned in the program that, you can't deny other people their experience, right? I've got a sponsee I work with now, and that was, has come up more than one occasion that there's a disruptive person or something in a meeting. They're going, "Well, why don't that?" Yeah, I said, "Well, listen, just You got to let those people have their experiences. You know, there's nothing wrong with you telling what you had to go through, but if somebody's not, is having a hard time, maybe it's not for you to tell them. Maybe the next person in line is going to be okay. Is going to get through. Um, and that's something else I'd like to mention to people who are going through the program right now, maybe for the first time, is I say that the first 9 steps are only like 50% of the program. The other 50% of the programs in the 10, 11, and 12. And of that, like 45% of that is in step 12. You really don't realize a lot of things, internalize a lot of things in this program until you work with another alcoholic. When you sit across the table or Zoom to Zoom, with another alcoholic and help take them through the steps. You learn a lot more about yourself going through it. At least I have. Um, so one of the things is what it's like now. I don't get as upset during the course of my day. Um, there are situations, work is work, and personalities are personalities. There are times when things clash, but I have tools now. I have things that I've learned in the program. The first being that pause, the second being um, kind of the live and let live is one that I struggle with I think the most, because in my line of work, somebody comes in and attacks the way my guys are doing things or something like that, and I have a tendency to go in instant defense mode. And hey, wait a minute, you can't act that way towards my people, um, which they appreciate it, but not everybody does. I've only gone to the principal's office a couple times. Um, but by and by, if I take the minute, you know, well, one of my favorite examples of how I can be reactionary. I don't know if any alcoholics ever had a reading problem, but my boss would send me an email and saying, "Can you do this?" That's what the email says. Can you do X, Y, Z, whatever it is. However, I read it as, why aren't you doing your blankety blank job? And rather than my first reaction is, what do you mean? I would have done it if you would have. I can pause now. I can take that second, and actually read what they wrote. Oh, they need me to do, no problem. I can do that, you know. Um, because I don't know about any other alcoholics, but I tend to be a little bit sensitive, especially when it comes to things I feel I do well, and I find out that maybe I'm not doing them as well as I could. Um, I have a tendency to take that a little personal. um, I think that the biggest thing is developing that connection, right? I've always, like I said, I've always had a faith. I didn't know faith in what, but I always had a faith that things would work out. You know, I don't know where that came from. Maybe that's just the beginning. Didn't mean that I didn't have a bunch of insecurities. And when you get into relationships, be it romantic relationships or relationships at work, insecurities tend to bounce off of each other. At least that's been my experience, right? I feel sometimes, they call it now. They have the great catchphrase, imposter syndrome. You know, even speaking with you guys, sometimes I get that feeling, the imposter syndrome, right? If they really, um, and so I learned it again. I was talking with my wife. She goes, "You're nervous?" I said, "Well, yeah, because I've been around these folks, for a bit. I don't want to let anybody down. It's been a while since I spoke, actually, so it's one of those things that, um, I mean, I know my experience. I know that I've kind of earned my seat, as we say. Uh, but sometimes you think, oh, the worst thing in the world could be if I just freeze up, right? Um, which I learn is not the hardest thing. I think it's funny because whenever there's a presentation or something to be done, um, I always jump right in. And I actually wasn't always like that. I was always, but I like through school, I kept on throwing myself in situations. I joined the performing arts, I did, I was in band, orchestra, choir, and drama, just so I could get out there and get over myself about going up in front of people. And it worked. But now it's kind of giving me part of my personality is I tend to be a little bit of a bulldozer. Um, and even though I had taken all these classes and learning how to listen effectively, found out I wasn't as good as I thought I was. And you want to ever learn about that, get in a romantic relationship. You find out really quickly that you're not as good as listening as you thought you were. You know, um, like I said, my wife's on, she can vouch for that. How many times it's like, no, that's not what I said. Oh, so, I have a friend of mine in the program. He always says, I don't think so good, you know, and I transfer that to, well, I already proven that I don't read so good every time my boss sends me an email, and I don't hear so good, every time, somebody says something I don't like. So I got to take those things into account before I react, before I take action. Um, and it doesn't always work. There's a gentleman at work that he knows just how to push my buttons, and works for the owner basically. And he's got me to blow up a couple times, and then all right, here comes that 10th step. You gotta look at that. Well, why did I blow up? Why did I let him get to me? you know, and look at what was behind it. And then the next day go and, you know, say, hey man, I'm sorry, that was very unprofessional of me. You know, let's work this out the best we can. Um, Nothing like eating crow though, uh, it gives you some humbleness, more humility to humbleness, but it does teach you about yourself. You know, it does teach you because when I was out there drinking, there was no way I'd go to somebody and, because I had to be right. I always had to be right. Um, and I know people, there's people in my life that that's their thing, right? They have to be right. And I can kind of look at that and go, wow, you know, I guess I was like that, sometimes still can be, you know, the person, looking stuff up on Google to prove you wrong. It's, you know, I've been accused of doing that once or twice. Um, but sometimes it's just much easier to be happy. You know, everybody again, if I remind myself, everybody has their journey, things go much smoother. I don't feel the need to combat their ideas or teach them the way that they have to do things and especially pertaining to the program. Um, but that passage, you know, kind of gave me the freedom to have a higher powered, of my own conception and, not have to use, get around that central idea of that, the God, um, which, again, if that's your belief, that's great too. I just, I don't have that belief. Um, I believe that, someone put it the best to me. They said, it's like a wagon wheel, right? Wagon wheel has spokes. If the central hub of that wagon wheel is God, then all these spokes all go to God, right? And all these spokes can be whether it be Thor or Odin or Great Spirit or wherever, they all lead to the same place. So there's room for everybody. Um, One of the things that I also had to learn was what service work actually is. That's why I like the responsibility statement. When anyone anywhere needs help, I want the hand of AA to be there, and for that I'm responsible. Doesn't say when another alcoholic needs help. It's when anyone anywhere needs help. You know, so that means that you know, and the book tells us that I'm to be of maximum service to my fellows. So if somebody's walking through some times that are kind of dark, it's great to be able to take some of these tools and help them. Uh, I had a gentleman at work explain to me that he had to leave. He's one of my inspectors. He had to leave early because his brother, who's paraplegic, was kind of freaking out. His mom, well, who was taking care of him, wound up going to the hospital. And he said he's being abusive to everybody. I gotta go find out what the heck's going on. I said, sounds to me like he's scared. The lady who's taking care of him's in the hospital, so he doesn't know what the heck's going to be happening next. And the guy got halfway out the door. He comes back, walking back in, and he goes, "You think that's it?" It's like, I don't know. That'd be how I'd react, probably. You know. And it turns out that was pretty much what was going on. But and he was able to get him calmed down and let him know that nobody was going to abandon him, leave him all by himself. That people would be there to help him out. Um, you know, so the fear thing that we all that I go through, I gotta stop doing that. We all, but it's important for me to realize that my fears aren't necessarily any different than yours, right? Because I'm not terminally unique in the way I feel sometimes. You know, that's one of the things that kind of kept me separated from the herd, as it were, for a long time. So you just don't get it, especially being this great psychic guy, you just don't get it. I'm different. I know these things. I had to realize that I'm not all that different, you know, and I actually have to put forth effort sometimes to say I'm just a run-of-the-mill alcoholic. I'm not any exalted speaker, because at one time that was another thing I wanted to do, is I wanted to be a motivational speaker. You know, I guess I'm not destined for that. I believe that that we teach that the work starts down here with us, right? It's not from up on some podium somewhere, you know, even the lowest of us. I remember sitting in a meeting, and this newcomer, had maybe been in like 2 or 3 weeks. Not all of us were sitting there. Most of us have over at least 4 or 5 years. And then something came out of this newcomer's mouth, and it was just like floored the entire room. And, it's like none of us has a monopoly on recovery, right? None of us have the way. And sometimes somebody who's brand new can see things a heck of a lot clearer than I can, because I've got all my jaded views. I've been through those steps. I know, it's like there's always another way, right? There's always another perspective. That's why I liked going to the Bronx Big Book, is we had so many different speakers, and they would take different parts of the book, and you get to hear another perspective on the part of the book that you heard, maybe about 4 or 5 months ago or whatever. So you got to hear things that, taken straight from the big book, and how somebody saw something and lived it, which helps you, right? It's we all are connected, and I always used to say, it's nothing like going to a room full of people who are just as nuts as I am, and they get me. Which, I used to have a crowd of people around me that basically got me because I told them to. You know, it's funny. It's weird how that works, but I was always the guy that kept the glue in the room, right? I kept people together. When I was in high school, um, there was a couple of us, a guy who's a rocker, a punk rocker, and then me who was just kind of a nerd, Star Trek nerd. Um, Took the same bus, dropped us off at the mall after school, and we said hello and all this other stuff, and we decided to go up for coffee at Nordstrom. Well, it went from 3 people to 40 people like in a month's time. Every day after school, we go up to Nordstrom's, get coffee, and it was it was crazy until to the fact where we had to start making deals with the people at Nordstrom's. The only 10 of us would come up at a time, but they didn't like us taking over their little cafe. Um, but and I always thought that, yeah, it was great. I was the guy that kept all the people together. I had counseling background. I knew what I was doing. Uh, I was nuts, and that was before I ever took any of my first serious drinks. I mean, I had drank a couple times up to that time, but nothing like what happened later on. There's nothing like sitting on a bar stool thinking that you got all these people around you that rely on you, and that just isn't true. But I've made it in my head. I made it true. You know, it's crazy. Um, Now in the program, there's people that they rely on the fellowship. Um, I can tell you that I was told coming back this time, I was told straight up, it said sooner or later the fellowship will let you down. you know, and that's in the part, in the part in the book, that tells us that, we're without defense against that first drink, unless we have a solid program, and a conscious contact with a power, a spiritual growth, conscious contact with a, power greater than ourselves, because, sometimes you're not going to be able to make a meeting, you're not going to be able to make a phone call, you got to do the work. You got to clear away that block. Whatever's blocking you from that higher power, whatever your concept of higher power may be. You got to clear away the block, and the only way to do that I've found is going through the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because I'm not as eloquent. I don't take notes. I don't, when I speak, I'm not at that stage yet. But um, so as I kind of jumping around. Um, I just a little discombobulated, like I said, so the recent events of the week, and trying to you know make sense of it all, and realizing I don't get to make sense of it all. I'm allowed not to make sense of it all. It drives me crazy, but there's always a grand plan, and I don't get to know what it is. I don't get to know what it is. I just have to have faith, that same faith I had when I was younger, that things are going to work out exactly the way they're supposed to, and that I have to do the next thing, right? I have to take the next step, um, whatever that may be, whether it be the next step, you know, you here's another thing that, I don't know if any alcoholic can identify with, but it took me a little bit to realize if my boss pays me for 8 hours to work, I ought to work those 8 hours. Because we work remotely, and I can get books on my computer and just read whatever I want, and it's like so amazing how much more productive you can be when you actually do that. Like I said, um, you know, little things that you learn, right? And it sounds stupid, but I it was all about, before it was all about getting over, right? I'm gonna get over on these folks. It's not about that now. You know, it's about doing what I agreed to do, and getting the job done that was assigned to me. Um, when a guy asked me to sponsor him, well, actually, at that time, my sponsor told me I ought to get a hold of this guy because he seems to be struggling. And so it was on Zoom, and so every time I saw him pop up, I'd say, "Hey man, how's it going?" You know, and I just kept doing that, and engaging him a little bit, and then finally, he like said, "You know what, some people have been, saying I need to get this done, so can you take me through it?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I can take you through it." And then that's when another fear starts in, right? It's like, hey, can I take him through it? You know, am I capable of doing what was done for me? And what I discovered is it's not one of those things it's gonna work out exactly the way it's supposed to. But you can't go far from wrong if you take the book and you go line by line, and you speak to your experience with the line. And what I also realized was that, you know, he had his own experiences, in relation to what was in the book that also made a lot of sense to me. And so, and I started off by approaching the whole idea of going through the book. I said, I want to take you through this book, you know, so that you can take the next person. I said, so there's going to be times I'm going to ask you to underline something or write something in the margin or something like that to help remind you of what happened when you went through the book, how it spoke to you, and the trick of turning statements into questions, like the bedevilments, you know, um, are these things happening in my life? Is this how I still approach people? These are all tools that were taught to me, and it's amazing how it worked, how it worked out, you know. Um, I still have not met my sponsee in person. He lives in one of the people. He's one of the folks off of Bronx Big Book, and he lives in New York. But one day we'll get together. Um, but it's amazing. We can reach people across the world now. That's crazy. We had some people on another online group. I don't even know if it exists anymore, but that one of the guys he was from Scotland, and I was working on the book, and I kept on giving him a hard time. I said, I'm listening to your accent very carefully because one of my characters in my book is Scottish, and I have to write that accent. He thought it was the funniest thing in the world. Um, but yeah, that was outright mental defectives, and I wish that I hadn't seen whether or not they're still online. I haven't been able to find them, and I've lost the number. So hopefully they're still going. It was a good group. Um, well, now I'm drawing a blank. Um, as much as I'd hate to be the guy to end it early, um, this is one of those things that, a while ago, it wouldn't have been a problem at all for me to talk about myself for an hour. Not so much these days. So thank you for, inviting me, folks.
And, thank you so much, Robert. And I'm going to just try and stop this recording.